Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that we currently have 2 applications out for the King's Indian on iPhone and on Android. Check them out. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll follow up on a look at the Brier variation of the Ruy Lopez. The Brier variation of the Ruy Lopez begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3 attacking the e5 pawn, knight to c6, bishop to b5, pawn to a6, bishop to a4 retreating the bishop, knight to f6, castles kingside, bishop to e7, rook to e1, pawn to b5, bishop to b3, pawn to d6, pawn to c3, castles kingside, pawn to h3, and now the key move of the Brier variation, knight to b8. In a previous video entitled the Brier variation, we already took a look at these initial moves and I explained in detail what's going on here. The Brier variation differs from other variations of the Ruy Lopez because black more often plays the move knight to a5 in this position, leading to the Jagoran variation. With the move knight to a5 after bishop to c2, black plans to plant his pawn on the c5 square with pawn to c5, and then later on he'll reposition the knight from a5, usually back to c6, and he'll try to play for some sort of queenside space advantage. However, in the Brier variation, black takes a little bit of a different approach towards the development of his pieces by first inserting the move knight to b8 with the idea of repositioning the knight onto the d7 square and then achieving a harmonious development and deployment of his queenside pieces as a result of having repositioned the knight. As it turns out, in the initial moves of the opening, when white played knight f3 on move 2 attacking the e5 pawn, I've pointed out in a couple different times that after white attacked the e5 pawn, black found it necessary to bring his knight to the c6 square. However, in so doing, he blocked the c pawn, the pawn on c7, and therefore the pawn was not able to participate in the fight for central dominance. And after moves like knight b8 or knight to a5, black is not only repositioning the pieces into a slightly more harmonious situation, but he's also creating the opportunity for the c-pawn to potentially get involved in the struggle. Now, naturally, white continues with the move pawn to d4, getting on with his central play here. And now, black continues with the move knight b to d7, shoring up the e5 pawn, just in time. Knight b to d2 is played, and now the move bishop to b7. And I feel this is really an essential point behind the Brier variation. Black is now able to bring the bishop to b7, and this is harder to do in the Jagoran variation because black will often need these squares in order to reposition his knight after it comes to a5. It will either need to come back to c6 or to b7, and in those cases, the bishop doesn't want to be on the b7 square. But here, after the repositioning of the knight back to b8 and now to d7, then the insertion of the move bishop to b7, black applies some extra pressure to the e4 pawn, and by doing so, he makes it a little bit difficult for white to complete the deployment of his pieces. For example, white would like to be able to play the move knight to f1 to g3 here, but if he does so in this position, he definitely drops the pawn on e4. And it's for this reason that white continues with the move bishop to c2 before getting on with the rest of his development, simply holding on to the pawn on e4. Black now continues with rook to e8, knight to f1 is played, bishop to f8, knight to g3, again just in time because black was threatening to capture on d4, unveiling another attacker on the e4 pawn, so knight g3 is quite essential here. And now we wrapped up the last video with the move pawn to g6. Now, after we looked at the last video, I gave some remarks indicating that white scores pretty well from this position. At first, it doesn't seem like a lot is going on here. Black is actually managing to develop his pieces in a harmonious way, and pretty soon he's going to have both of his bishops developed onto long diagonals. However, white does have the seeds for some very small advantages that he can work with here. The first advantage entails some extra central scope. His pawn on d4 is further advanced than the pawn on d6, and as a result, white is going to have a little bit easier of a time repositioning his minor pieces and also his heavy pieces. He'll be able to bring the queen out to a square such as e2 or d2 and then reposition his rooks however he'd like. And this is something that black will have just a little bit more difficulty with in his own position due to the fact that the pawn on d6 is a little bit more cramping here. Also, if we take a look at the position of the knight on g3 relative to the knight on d7, we see that white's knight is not only a little bit more in contact with the center and with some squares on the king side, whereas black's knight on d7 is slightly passively placed, but at the same time the knight also is not crowding in the pieces in the center, and this allows white a little bit more maneuvering space, which will eventually pay him some dividends in terms of his ability to coordinate his pieces and generate threats. Also, a more hidden factor in this position is that the pawn on b5 is slightly exposed to attack. For example, one of the moves which white has available in this position is to play the move pawn to a4, beginning an immediate assault against the b5 pawn, and then planning to exchange this pawn and then attack it with moves like queen to e2 and bishop to d3. This move, because black will have to add some more defense to the b5 pawn, black often finds it necessary to constrain himself to playing the move pawn to c6 as a prophylactic measure later on in these positions, and this means that this pawn will not be able to come out to the c5 square, and it will be blocking the bishop on b7. So another advantage for white in this position turns out to be white's ability to add some pressure to the b5 pawn. Now, we're going to look at a game in which Grandmaster Leko was playing the white pieces against another Grandmaster in this position. And in this game, instead of playing the move pawn to a4, which is a very popular move in this position, instead, Leko played another alternative which is also well known here, which is the move pawn to b3. And I quite like this move. With the move pawn to b3, white is preparing to use not the a pawn, which would allow some exchanges down the a file later on, but instead, white hopes to later on play the move pawn to c4 as a means of attacking the pawn on d5, usually after playing the move pawn to d5. And this strategy, I believe, turns out to be just a little bit more effective than the move pawn to a4. Again, perhaps because it doesn't set the rooks up in juxtaposition, and therefore allows white to keep some more material on the board. And one of the principles of handling an advantage of space is that usually we try to avoid exchanging pieces when we have an advantage in space, because the more pieces which are traded, the less significant the difference in territory becomes, as there are simply fewer pieces the defender has to coordinate behind the pawns. Therefore, in this game, Leko continued with the move pawn to b3. Now, there are a few different moves which black has at his disposal in this position. And the move which Nigel Short chose in this game, which we're looking at now, was the move bishop to g7, very common here, simply continuing on with the development scheme. However, as we'll see in a moment, white, after bishop to g7, played the move pawn to d5. And in order to try to neutralize this idea, some players begin with the move pawn to c6 immediately, and this is one idea in the position. I feel it's pretty obvious that if black plays the move pawn to c6, white does have a little bit of an advantage in this position, as his position is just a little bit easier to develop, and black is rather passively placed. Another move which has gained some popularity is to strike with the move pawn to d5, immediately throwing the position into all kinds of tactical complications, which can be looked at at another time. However, in this game, black played bishop to g7, and now white played a very sensible move, pawn to d5, making sure that this diagonal is never going to open up, and also removing the pawn from the d4 square so that pretty soon white is going to be able to play pawn to c4, continuing on with white's strategy here. And now, a period of maneuvering took place in this game. Nigel Short played queen to e7, Leko continued with pawn to c4, pawn to c6 was played, bishop to e3, and now simply the move rook e to c8. Again, not a whole lot happening here. Black is preparing to develop and defend his queen side against the potential assault, because at any time in this position, white is close to being able to capture on c6, followed by capturing on b5, or white could also look for moves like queen to d2, followed by bringing a rook to the d1 square. But by now, I think it's very clear, black is not generating any threats of his own in this position. Both of his bishops, which are developed here on what are usually very nice diagonals, are suppressed in this position. Both bishops are not actually participating too much as they're blocked by their own pawns, and we definitely have a closed position on hands here. White is benefiting from the fact that his c pawn and his d pawn are much further advanced than their counterparts on c6 and on d6, and white has some chances of creating an attack by capturing these pawns at some point and then putting some pressure on the queen side. And as we're going to see, this is exactly what happened as the game wore along. Now, white continued with the move rook to c1, simply getting on with his play in this position. And from here, it seems to me that black had some chance of continuing to defend rather passively with simply the move rook to c7, and then perhaps bringing the other rook to the c8 square, and at some point looking to exchange these pawns. B takes c4, B takes c4, C takes d5, C takes d5, and then bringing this knight to the c5 square. If black would have played in this way, I feel Leko would have had a hard time breaking through, but he still would have had long-term chances associated with attacking the a6 pawn, as again, many of black's pieces are having some trouble recoordinating themselves, and white can quickly bring attackers to the a6 pawn. So it's understandable that black wanted to remove this weakness first, and this is what he attempted to do with the move pawn to a5. But it seems to me like this was the beginning of some substantial weakening, as now the pawn on b5 is much more likely to come under an assault, and white has some additional time for the development of his own attack. Play continued with the move queen to d2. Not only does this move, again, potentially prepare the move rook e to d1, which then creates threats of taking on c6 and attacking d6, but at the same time, the newly weakened pawn on a5 is now under observation for the queen, and so black does not have any options of doubling up his rooks on the c file, for example, rook c7, rook a c8, because the pawn on a5 would be hanging. Now, again, black's position is not super critical yet. It doesn't seem that anything is really going wrong here, but there is this nagging concern that white will eventually develop overwhelming threats against the queen side and win a pawn. And these kinds of positions end up being very difficult for black to play. And this is what I feel ends up being the problem for black in the Brier variation, especially when he plays it defensively in this way. Black found it necessary to make some conversions in the position by now playing b takes c4, b takes c4, c takes d5, c takes d5, and now knight to c5. It just appears that Nigel Short really felt like it was time to get some activity going, and this is understandable. However, white now has some nagging pressure against the a5 pawn, and Leko found a very beautiful idea here with the move bishop to d3. The idea is, if black captures on d3, white can either capture on d3, or more likely, he'll exchange rooks on the c8 square first, capture on d3, and then he has the chance of bringing his queen to a3 and playing against the pawn on a5. And this would be a rather healthy exchange for white, since the bishop on d3 ends up being white's worst minor piece at the moment, since the pawns are fixed on light squares, and this knight on c5 is fairly significant. Therefore, black doesn't want to change on d3, but white is beginning to develop some pressure ideas here. Ideally, white would like to capture on c5 and create a second weakness in the position by forcing black to eventually capture on c5 with a pawn. In that case, black will then have weaknesses on c5, he'll have a weakness on a5, and white will also have a pass pawn on d5. And again, black managed to come up with some kind of move here, but it just looks like he's going in the wrong direction as he played the move pawn to h5. White was able to capture with bishop takes c5, d takes c5, and now it appears that black is hoping to play the move knight e8 to d6 as a means of blockading the pawn on d5. But Leko comes up with a very elegant move here. He plays the move queen to g5, pinning the knight on f6 and preventing the maneuver knight e8 to d6. And this is something which recently I've been seeing in a lot of strong players' games, is the ability to deploy the queen in an active way, as white has done here, and to use the queen for very strong purposes. A very insightful move by Leko. Now the position is beginning to look quite critical for black, as at any time white can remaneuver his knight to the c4 square, start putting pressure on any of these pawns, and the e5 pawn is also under pressure, and there's of course is always the possibility that at some point black could even find his kingside weakened. And again, black doesn't appear to have done much wrong in this position. He began with the Brier variation, brought his knight to b8, brought his knight to d7, got the bishops out to different squares, but somehow through a gradual process, white has simply remaneuvered his pieces, was able to capture on c5, creating new weaknesses, and now black's position is getting critical. Now, black detects that it's possible to play the move rook to c7 here, defending the queen on e7 and perhaps preparing the maneuver knight e8 to d6. At first it may seem that this isn't possible because of the move queen takes e5. However, black can reply with knight takes d5, regaining the pawn, at the same time creating a threat against the queen, and if white captures on e7, there's the possibility of knight takes e7. And similarly, if white plays knight takes e5, once again the move knight takes d5 is going to be tactically adequate. Instead though, Leko plays another very excellent move here. He plays knight to f1. So he's not going to use the f3 knight to get to c4. Instead, he's going to use the f1 knight to come to d2 and then to c4, applying additional pressure to the e5 pawn. A very nice maneuver by Leko in this position. At the same time, once the knight arrives to c4, it will be greatly complicating black's task of placing his knight on d6. Now, before black can play the move knight to e8, he still has to deal with the coverage of his c5 pawn, since here there's queen takes e7, rook takes e7, and rook takes c5. Therefore, black continued with rook a to c8, knight 1 to d2 was played. Now finally knight to e8, queen takes e7, rook takes e7, knight to c4, and yet from this point, white has a very, very powerful advantage. He's attacking the a5 pawn, his knight is ideally placed, the d6 square is under control, and it's really just a matter of time before black's position is going to collapse. And so very quickly, let's take a look at how the game finished off. Play finished up with bishop to a6, knight f takes e5, bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, pawn to c4, bishop takes c4, rook takes e5, bishop takes a6, rook takes c1, rook takes c1, rook takes e4. So presently white is up one pawn, still a weakness on a5 available here. The bishop is much better situated than the rook. And now white played pawn to f3. Black has to be very careful about rook to c8 followed by bishop to b5, potentially picking up the knight. And now the game finished with a petite combination after black played rook to e5, attacking the d5 pawn, rook to c5, getting ready to pick up this second weakness on a5, but after Nigel Short threw in the move pawn to h4, rather than taking on a5, the game ended abruptly after Leko played pawn to d6, a very nice finishing move here. The idea of which is that now if rook takes c5, pawn to d7, the pawn is threatening to promote both on the e8 square and on the d8 square, and so there's simply no solution after the move pawn to d6. This pawn is going to get through, or it's going to cost black an entire rook with rook takes e5, and therefore black resigned. Now what have we learned as a result of this game? We've gotten a chance to reiterate the ideas behind the Brier variation, and so we've simply introduced this possibility and learned what happens if black plays knight to b8. At the same time, Leko has given us a very good example of the utilization of a space advantage, here first gaining a little bit of extra territory in the center, repositioning his pieces, and eventually creating some very small weaknesses on the queen side, but it was more than enough to eventually overpower Nigel Short with a couple of very clever maneuvers, one of my favorite moves in this game being queen to g5. That's all for today, and we'll see you again soon. Before you go, if you have an opportunity, be sure to check out that we have 3 applications available on the Queen's Gambit Decline, available for iPhone and for Android. Check them out.